He sold over 1 billion records, more than any solo artist in history. His home, Graceland, is the second most visited private residence in America after the White House. Decades after his death, people still make pilgrimages to his grave. They dress like him. They sing his songs. He is a global icon, a myth, a legend. His name is Elvis Presley. But, who was he? The more you read about Elvis, the less you seem to know. Was he a shy, humble mama's boy? Or was he a calculating predator? Was he a musical genius who changed the world? Or a talented mimic who got lucky? Was his manager a brilliant visionary or a greedy parasite? Over 1,000 biographies have been written about him, and they can't seem to agree on the most fundamental things. One book paints him as a saint, the next paints him as a monster. The truth gets lost in a fog of competing stories, personal agendas, and fading memories. Every story about Elvis seems to have an opposite, equally convincing story. He was generous. He was selfish. He was a disciplined artist. He was a lazy slob. He was a spiritual seeker. He was a drug addict. He was a king. He was a prisoner. The contradictions are baffling, and they force us to ask a simple, terrifying question. Can we ever truly know another person, especially one who lived life under the blinding glare of fame? Maybe the real Elvis doesn't exist in any one book. Maybe he only exists in the spaces between them, in the questions they can't answer. The number 18 was his film career a waste. Some people will tell you Elvis Presley could have been a great actor. They say he had the raw talent, the charisma, the screen presence of a James Dean or a Marlon Brando. They point to his early films. Look at King Creole from 1958, directed by Michael Curtiz, the same man who directed Casablanca. Elvis is fantastic in it. He's intense. He's believable. Look at Jailhouse Rock from 1957. That famous dance sequence wasn't choreographed. He made it up himself. It's pure, raw energy. He had something special. Even legendary producer Hal Wallace, who signed Elvis to his first movie contract with Paramount Pictures, saw it. He believed Elvis had the potential for dramatic roles. Elvis himself wanted it. He admired actors like James Dean. He desperately wanted to be taken seriously. He read books on acting. He tried. The story goes that his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, killed that dream. The Colonel had a formula. It was a business formula, not an artistic one. A movie a year, sometimes 3. The scripts were cheap and interchangeable. Elvis plays a race car driver. Elvis plays a boat captain. Elvis plays a pilot. The plots were thin. The songs were often terrible. Think of Do the Clam or Yoga is as Yoga does. But the formula worked. Each movie made millions. Each soundtrack album sold millions. For a decade, from roughly 1960 to 1969, Elvis was trapped in this cycle. Peter Guralnick, in his definitive 2-volume biography, Last Train to Memphis and Careless Love, details Elvis's growing frustration and eventual resignation. He would complain about the scripts. He would beg for better material. He was offered the lead male role opposite Barbra Streisand in the 1976 remake of A Star is Born. It was a serious, dramatic part, a chance to redefine himself. But the Colonel's financial demands were so outrageous that the studio walked away. The role went to Chris Christopherson. The dream died. But there's another side to this story, a more complicated one. This version says Elvis was not just a victim, he was a willing participant. The movies were easy. They didn't require the emotional toll that his live performances did. He would show up, say his lines, sing a few songs, and collect a massive paycheck. He was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood for years. Albert Goldman, in his controversial and scathing 1981 biography Elvis, paints a picture of a lazy, undisciplined star who lost his ambition. And Goldman argues that Elvis didn't have the work ethic or the emotional depth to be a truly great actor. He preferred the comfort of the formula. He was surrounded by his friends, the Memphis Mafia. They would play football and ride go-karts on the studio backlots. It was a comfortable life. And let's be honest about the business. The Colonel's formula kept Elvis a household name. While the Beatles and the British invasion were changing the face of music, Elvis was still on screen. He was still present. The movies, as bad as they were a brilliant marketing tool that bridged a difficult period in his musical career. Without them, would he have even been in a position to make his legendary 1968 comeback special? Maybe not. So was he the frustrated artist, a caged bird who could have soared? Or was he the lazy millionaire happy to trade his art for an easy life? The evidence supports both. What if the Colonel had let him take the role in A Star is Born? Would it have been a triumph or a critical failure that embarrassed him? Did Elvis secretly fear the challenge of a serious role, preferring to stick with what he knew? If he hated the movie script so much, why did he not use his immense power and wealth to simply refuse to make them? Was the prison of Hollywood one? He helped build himself. Number 17, was he a musical genius or a gifted copycat? This is one of the most sensitive and explosive contradictions in the Elvis story. To millions, he was the king, the man who invented rock and roll. His voice, his style, his energy, it all felt brand new, like it came from another planet. When Sam Phillips, the head of Sun Records in Memphis, first heard Elvis sing That's All Right in July 1954, he knew he had found something revolutionary. Phillips had famously said, "If I could find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, I could make $1 billion." In Elvis, he found him. The sound was a fusion. It was country music, the music of white, rural America. And it was rhythm and blues, the music of black America. Elvis blended them together in a way no one had done before. He created a new language. Writers like Peter Guralnick argue for Elvis's unique genius. He wasn't just copying, he was synthesizing. He took the elements he loved, the gospel he heard in church, the blues he heard on Beale Street, the country he heard on the radio, and filtered them through his own unique personality. His vocal phrasing was his own. His energy was his own. He was an interpreter of songs, but in his hands, a song became something new. Think of his version of Big Mama Thornton's Hound Dog. Thornton's version is a slow, powerful blues growl. Elvis's version is a snarling, frantic rock and roll explosion. It's a different song entirely. He didn't just sing the notes, he inhabited the music. This view holds that Elvis was a true artist, a visionary who saw connections between different musical worlds and built a bridge between them. But then there's the other side, the accusation of cultural appropriation. This argument states that Elvis didn't invent anything. He simply took black music, repackaged it for a white audience, and got all the credit and all the money. In the segregated 1950s, black artists like Arthur Big Boy Crudup, who wrote That's All Right, couldn't get mainstream radio play. Elvis could. He sang Crudup's song and it launched his career. Crudup died in poverty. This perspective doesn't necessarily deny Elvis's talent. It questions his originality and the fairness of the system that elevated him. His critics point out that many of his biggest hits were covers of songs originally recorded by black artists. They argue that he was a very good singer, a great performer, but not an innovator. He was in the right place at the right time. This debate became particularly heated around the infamous and likely apocryphal quote attributed to Elvis, "The only thing Negroes can do for me is buy my records and shine my shoes." Though no credible source has ever verified, he said it. The rumor has persisted for decades, fueling the narrative that he was a racist thief. People who knew him, including black artists like B.B. King, always defended him, saying he was respectful and always gave credit to his influences. He would openly talk about his love for artists like Fats Domino and Sister Rosetta Tharpe. Yet, the question remains, was he a bridge between cultures, a genius who created a new form? Or was he the beneficiary of a racist system, a talented copycat who became a king, while the original creators were left behind? Did Elvis truly understand the social and political implications of the music he was singing? Was his fusion of black and white music a conscious artistic choice, or just the natural sound of a poor boy who grew up in a mixed neighborhood? If he had been born black, with the exact same talent, would we have ever heard of him? And does the fact that he made millions from a culture that was not his own diminish his artistic legacy, regardless of his intent? Number 16. Was he a racist? This is the question that haunts the Elvis legacy. It's a simple question with no simple answer. The story is built around that one quote, the one about shining shoes. It first appeared in a 1957 article in a black-owned magazine, Sepia. The article didn't claim to have heard him say it directly. It was hearsay. Elvis was devastated by the accusation. He publicly and passionately denied it. He told Jet magazine, another prominent black publication, "I never said anything like that, and people who know me know I wouldn't have said it." He went on to list the black musicians he admired and was influenced by. He said, "Let's face it, I can't sing like Fats Domino can. I know that." Many people who knew him, both black and white, rushed to his defense. B.B. King, a legend of the blues, was a friend. He said he never saw a hint of racism in Elvis. James Brown, the godfather of soul, called Elvis a brother. Muhammad Ali, a powerful voice for black rights, adored him. The Stamps Quartet, a white gospel group that backed him in his later years, included J.D. Sumner. Sumner recalled how in the segregated South, Elvis would defy local customs. He'd go to black amusement parks on their designated colored nights. He'd visit black churches, and evidence suggests he was, for a white man from Mississippi in the 1950s, remarkably progressive in his personal interactions. He seemed to judge people on their character, not their color, but the other side of the argument is not about personal prejudice. It's about a systemic issue. Did Elvis personally hate black people? The evidence says no. But did he benefit from a system that was deeply racist? The evidence says yes. This is the core of the contradiction. You can look at his life and see no overt acts of personal racism. But you can also look at his career and see the story of a white artist becoming a global superstar by performing a style of music created by black artists who were denied the same opportunities. The argument isn't that Elvis set out to steal music. It's that the industry, the radio stations, and the culture of the time were structured to promote a white face. Arthur Crudup wrote and recorded "That's All Right" in 1946. It went nowhere. Elvis recorded it in 1954, and it became a sensation. That is not Elvis's fault, but it is a fact of his story. So the question becomes more complex. Can a person be personally non-racist while also being the face of a racially biased system? This is where the debate still rages. Some argue that his love for the music was a form of appreciation, not appropriation. Others argue that good intentions don't change the outcome, that he became rich and famous from a culture he didn't belong to, while the originator struggled. He never marched for civil rights. He never used his massive platform to speak out against segregation. He was a product of his time, a man who largely stayed silent on political issues. In the eyes of some, this silence makes him complicit. In the eyes of others, it makes him an artist focused on his music, not a political activist. The contradiction lies in judging a man from another era by the standards of today. Was he a man who privately rejected racism, but publicly did nothing to fight it? Did Elvis ever feel guilty about the disparity between his success and the struggles of the black artists who inspired him? Was his silence on racial issues a form of cowardice or a calculated business decision made by Colonel Parker to avoid controversy? If he had been more politically active, would his white Southern fan base have abandoned him? And can we separate the man's personal beliefs from the systemic realities that defined his career? Number 15 was Colonel Parker, a genius or a monster? There is no Elvis Presley story without Colonel Tom Parker. He was there from almost the beginning to the very end. And for every person who says the Colonel made Elvis, there is another who says he destroyed him. He was a brilliant, cunning, and utterly ruthless manager. Was he a visionary who guided a young talent to unprecedented global fame? Or was he a parasitic conman who bled his client dry? The truth is, he was probably both. Let's look at the genius argument first. The Colonel was a master promoter, a P.T. Barnum for the rock and roll age. He had come from the carnival world. He knew how to build hype. He knew how to create a brand. When he took over Elvis's contract in 1955, Elvis was a regional star. The Colonel saw the global potential. He secured the groundbreaking deal with RCA Records. He negotiated the movie contracts with Paramount and MGM. He orchestrated Elvis's appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, which made him a national phenomenon. An estimated 60 million people, a third of the country, watched his final appearance in 1957. The Colonel understood merchandising in a way no one else did. He sold Elvis hats, Elvis dolls, Elvis lipstick. He plastered Elvis's face on everything. He made Elvis an inescapable part of American culture. After the army, he guided Elvis through the Hollywood years, which, for all their artistic faults, were a massive financial success. He then engineered the triumphant return to live performing in Las Vegas in 1969, securing a record-breaking deal with the International Hotel. The man knew how to make money, but the monster argument is just as compelling. The Colonel's control was absolute. He took an unprecedented 50% commission for much of Elvis's career. The industry standard was 10 to 15%. This fact alone is shocking, but it goes deeper. The Colonel was not actually a colonel. His name was not Tom Parker. He was Andreas van Kooik, an illegal immigrant from the Netherlands, possibly on the run from a murder investigation. This is a key fact discovered by his biographer Alana Nash in her book, The Colonel. Because he had no passport and feared being discovered, he never allowed Elvis to tour internationally. Think about that. Elvis Presley, the biggest star in the world, never performed a major concert outside of North America. The demand was insane. He could have sold out stadiums in Europe, Japan, Australia. He never got the chance. The Colonel's personal secret limited Elvis's global reach. Furthermore, critics like Albert Goldman argue the Colonel's focus was always on the short-term cash grab, never on Elvis's long-term artistic health. The cheap movies, the terrible soundtrack songs, that was the Colonel's formula. He rejected artistically challenging projects because they were risky. He worked Elvis to the bone, especially in the 1970s. The grueling Las Vegas schedules, the non-stop touring. When Elvis's health was clearly failing, the Colonel pushed him to keep performing because the money was too good. He surrounded Elvis with people who would keep him compliant, not people who would challenge him. After Elvis's death, he continued to manage the estate, taking his 50% cut, until a court case in the early 1980s exposed his practices as unethical and removed him. Was he the brilliant architect of a global empire, or was he a small-time carny who got lucky and latched onto a once-in-a-lifetime talent, ultimately crippling him? He protected Elvis from the press, but he also isolated him from the world. He made him a very rich man, but at what cost to his art and his health? If the Colonel had been a legitimate American citizen, would an Elvis World Tour in the 1960s have changed music history? Did the Colonel's greed directly contribute to Elvis's early death by pushing him to perform when he was unwell? And the biggest question of all, without the Colonel's ruthless ambition in the early days, would Elvis have ever become more than a local Memphis sensation? Number 14, was he a spiritual seeker or a confused dabbler? Elvis Presley was a man of faith, or at least he was a man obsessed with finding it. This is a side of him that often gets lost behind the image of the hip-shaking rock star or the bloated Vegas caricature. He was raised in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, Mississippi. Gospel music was his first love. It was the foundation of everything he did musically. He would sing gospel songs to warm up before shows, to relax on his tour bus. The only Grammy Awards he ever won for his music were for his gospel albums. He could quote scripture, he carried a Bible with him. By all accounts, his Christian faith was a real and important part of his life. But it wasn't the whole story. As he got older and more isolated by fame, he began searching for answers in other places. He became a voracious reader of spiritual and esoteric books. In the mid-1960s, he became deeply involved with his hairdresser, Larry Geller. Geller introduced him to a world of spiritual literature. Books like The Impersonal Life of the Prophet by Khalil Gibran and Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. If Elvis was consumed by them, he would read passages aloud to the Memphis Mafia. He believed he had healing powers. He talked about seeing visions. He wore a cross, a Star of David, and other spiritual symbols, believing they all pointed to the same God. This was a man genuinely grappling with the big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is my purpose? Peter Guralnick's Careless Love details this period extensively, showing a man desperate for meaning beyond the screaming crowds and hollow movie scripts. But there's a much more cynical view of Elvis's spiritual journey. Albert Goldman, for one, portrays him as a gullible, simple-minded man who fell for every spiritual fad that came his way. In this view, he wasn't a seeker, he was a dabbler. He was looking for easy answers and quick fixes. His interest was intense, but shallow. He would become obsessed with a book or an idea for a few months, declare it the ultimate truth, and then move on to the next thing. He talked about wanting to enter a monastery, but he never gave up his extravagant lifestyle. He preached about purity and spiritual discipline while indulging in junk food, prescription drugs, and casual relationships. The Memphis Mafia, in their various books and interviews, often expressed their confusion and sometimes their ridicule for his holy roller phase. They saw it as another one of Elvis's whims, like his obsession with karate or police badges. They would sit for hours, forced to listen to him read from his books, while all they wanted to do was go out and have fun. So was he a deeply spiritual man on a genuine, if sometimes misguided, quest for enlightenment? Or was he a bored, lonely superstar, using esoteric books and spiritual gurus as just another form of distraction, no different from his collection of cars or his addiction to pills? The contradiction is between a man searching for God and a man trying to escape himself. Like, if he was so deeply spiritual, how did he reconcile that with his destructive lifestyle of drug abuse? Was his search for a higher power a genuine quest, or just another symptom of an addictive personality latching onto a new obsession? And if he had found the spiritual peace he was looking for, would it have saved him? Number 13 was the Memphis Mafia, a band of brothers or a pack of enablers. You can't talk about Elvis's life without talking about the Memphis Mafia. This was his inner circle, a group of friends, family, and employees who were with him 24/7. The name was coined by the press in the early 1960s, seeing them as a dark-suited entourage surrounding their king. They were his bodyguards, his road managers, his confidantes, and his playmates. To Elvis, they were his family, the only people he could trust in a world that only wanted a piece of him. The positive view of the Memphis Mafia is that they were fiercely loyal. Many of them, like Red West and Jerry Schilling, were friends from his youth in Memphis. They were with him before he was famous. They protected him from crazed fans. They shielded him from the pressures of the outside world. They created a bubble where Elvis could feel normal, or as normal as possible. And Jerry Schilling's book, Me and a Guy Named Elvis, paints a picture of deep friendship and brotherhood. They shared jokes, played football, and were there for him during his darkest moments, like the death of his mother. In this narrative, they were a necessary support system, a human shield that allowed Elvis to function under the insane pressures of being the most famous person on the planet. They were paid, yes, but their loyalty was real. But there is a much darker interpretation of their role. This view sees the Memphis Mafia not as friends, but as paid sycophants, yes men. Enablers who were on the payroll to cater to Elvis's every whim, no matter how self-destructive. Albert Goldman's biography is particularly brutal in its assessment, describing them as little more than high-priced gophers. They procured women for him. They kept his secrets, and most damningly, they stood by and watched as he descended into prescription drug addiction. They saw him taking handfuls of pills. They saw his health deteriorating, but their jobs, their cars, their houses, it all depended on keeping Elvis happy. And challenging Elvis was the one thing you didn't do. The ultimate act of this contradiction came in 1976. 3 members of the inner circle, Red West, his cousin Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, were fired by Elvis's father, Vernon. The following year, just weeks before Elvis's death, they published a tell-all book called Elvis: What Happened. The book was shocking. It was the first time the public got a real glimpse into the dark side of Elvis's life, the drug abuse, the paranoia, the bizarre behavior. At the time, they were seen as traitors, cashing in on their friend's misery. They claimed they wrote the book as a desperate wake-up call, a last-ditch effort to shock Elvis into getting help. But many, including Elvis himself, saw it as the ultimate betrayal. He was reportedly heartbroken by it. So what were they, a loyal band of brothers trying to protect their friend? Or a gang of enablers who facilitated his decline and then sold him out when the money stopped? The truth probably shifts depending on which member you ask and on which day. They were human. They were likely a complicated mix of both. If the Memphis Mafia were true friends, why did none of them stage a successful intervention to save Elvis from his drug addiction? Was their loyalty to Elvis, or to the lavish lifestyle he provided? And did the book Elvis: What Happened? Number 12. Was his generosity genuine or a form of control? Stories of Elvis Presley's generosity are legendary. He was famous for it. He would give away cars, houses, jewelry. If he heard a stranger was in trouble, he might pay off their mortgage. He famously bought Cadillacs for friends, family, and sometimes people he had just met. There are countless stories. He once saw an elderly woman looking at a car in a dealership showroom. He walked in, bought it for her, and walked out. He gave a custom-made limousine to his gospel backup singer, J.D. Sumner. He bought homes for many of his friends and family. On a whim, he would take his entire entourage on shopping sprees, buying them thousands of dollars worth of clothes or jewelry. He donated to charities, often anonymously. Every Christmas, he would give a large sum to Memphis charities. On the surface, this looks like the behavior of an incredibly kind and generous man, a poor boy who made it big and wanted to share his wealth. This is the narrative that many who knew him, like his friend Jerry Schilling, promote. They saw it as pure unadulterated kindness. Elvis remembered what it was like to be poor. He grew up in a 2-room shotgun shack in Tupelo. His family struggled. He never forgot that. Giving things to people brought him genuine joy. In a life that became increasingly isolated and strange, giving was a way for him to connect with people. It was a way to see a real, immediate, happy reaction on someone's face. For a man who had everything, the act of giving might have been one of the few things that felt real. But there is a more cynical interpretation of this behavior. This view argues that Elvis's generosity was not about kindness. It was about power and control. By giving people extravagant gifts, he created a relationship of dependency. The Memphis Mafia didn't just work for him, they were indebted to him. He paid their bills. He bought their houses, he gave them their cars. How could you say no to a man who controlled every aspect of your financial life? How could you tell him he was taking too many pills or that his latest girlfriend wasn't good for him, when you knew he could take it all away in an instant? In this light, the gifts were not gifts. They were golden handcuffs. Albert Goldman's book heavily pushes this theory. He portrays Elvis as a benevolent dictator, using his checkbook to ensure absolute loyalty and obedience. The generosity was a tool to keep people around him, to keep them from having lives of their own. It was a way to cure his own loneliness. He was buying friendship. He was buying love. It was also perhaps a way to deal with his own insecurities. By being the great provider, the king handing out favors, he reinforced his own status and power. The act of giving made him feel good, not just because he was helping someone, but because it affirmed his control over his world. Was he the big-hearted country boy who never forgot where he came from? Or was he a lonely, insecure man using his vast wealth to buy loyalty and create a world where no one would ever tell him no? The same act, giving away a Cadillac, can be seen as an act of incredible kindness or an act of subtle manipulation. Did Elvis give gifts expecting something in return, even if it was just unspoken loyalty? Was he capable of having a real friendship with someone who didn't financially depend on him? If one of his friends had refused a major gift, how would he have reacted? And was the joy he got from giving truly selfless, or was it the selfish pleasure of a man exercising his immense power? Number 11. Was he a simple country boy or a secret intellectual? The public image of Elvis Presley was always that of a simple country boy. He had a southern drawl. He used folksy grammar. He said "sir" and "mom." He was polite, humble, and a little shy. The press loved this angle. The boy from Tupelo who made it big but never lost his roots. Colonel Parker carefully cultivated this image. It made Elvis relatable. It made him non-threatening to mainstream America. Elvis himself often played into this role. He didn't talk like a philosopher. He talked about his mom, his love for America, and his gratitude for his success. Musically, his roots were in simple, direct forms: blues, country, gospel. He wasn't a complex lyricist or a trained composer. But he was a feel singer. This image of the intuitive, unsophisticated genius is powerful and has persisted for decades. Many of his own friends, and even his wife, Priscilla, have described him in these terms. In her book, Elvis and Me, Priscilla Presley talks about having to read books to him. She portrays him as someone with a quick mind, but not a scholarly one. The members of the Memphis Mafia were not intellectuals. Their conversations were about girls, cars, movies, and jokes. This was the world Elvis created for himself. It was a world that seemed to confirm the simple country boy persona. However, a completely different picture emerges when you look at the books he was reading. This isn't just about the spiritual books mentioned earlier. He read widely. He had a personal library at Graceland with hundreds of books on religion, history, philosophy, and poetry. He wasn't just collecting them, he was reading them. He would underline passages and make notes in the margins. Larry Geller, his spiritual guide, was one of the few people Elvis shared this side of himself with. Geller's book, If I Can Dream, reveals an Elvis the public never knew: a man who was curious, thoughtful, and searching for knowledge. He was interested in the teachings of auras, numerology, and the history of world religions. He was far from the uneducated hillbilly of his public image, so which one was the real Elvis? Was the bookish intellectual a persona he adopted to impress people like Geller? Or was the "aw shucks" country boy an act he put on for the public and even for his closest friends? It's possible that both were real. He was a man of contradictions. He could be deeply philosophical one moment and obsessed with a childish prank the next. He might have kept his intellectual curiosity private because he was insecure about his lack of formal education. Perhaps he felt that his friends, the Memphis Mafia, wouldn't understand or would make fun of him. So he compartmentalized his life. With them, he was one of the boys. Alone, or with a trusted few, he was a seeker of knowledge. The contradiction is stark. The man who sang All Shook Up was the same man who was underlining passages in books about esoteric philosophy. The world saw the pelvis. They didn't see the bookshelf. Was Elvis's intellectual curiosity a genuine trait, or a phase he went through like his interest in karate? Did he hide his intelligence because he was afraid it would alienate his fan base? Who would he have been if he had gone to college instead of becoming a rock and roll star? And did the simple country boy persona ultimately become a trap that prevented him from being taken seriously as an artist and a thinker? Number 10. Was he trapped by fame, or did he choose his prison? From the outside, Elvis Presley lived a life of unimaginable freedom. He had unlimited money. He could have anything he wanted, go anywhere he wanted, but the reality was the opposite. By the 1960s, and certainly by the 1970s, Elvis was a prisoner. He was a prisoner in his own home, Graceland. He was a prisoner in his hotel suites in Las Vegas. He couldn't go to a grocery store. He couldn't walk down the street. He couldn't go to a movie theater without renting the entire place out after hours. If he stepped outside, he would be mobbed. His life was not his own. This narrative of Elvis as the tragic prisoner of fame is very powerful. Peter Guralnick's Careless Love masterfully details the suffocating nature of his celebrity. His world shrank until it consisted of only a few rooms and a few familiar faces. He slept all day and lived at night, a nocturnal existence to avoid the public. He was surrounded by bodyguards. Every meal, every activity was managed. He was isolated, lonely, and bored. This boredom and isolation are often cited as the primary reasons for his descent into drug abuse. The pills were a way to escape the crushing emptiness of a life lived in a golden cage. He was a victim of a level of fame that no one had ever experienced before. There was no blueprint for how to handle it, but there's a counter-argument. This argument suggests that Elvis actively chose his prison. He could have fought against the isolation. He could have insisted on more freedom, but he didn't. In some ways, the bubble was comfortable. Inside the bubble, he was the king. His every whim was catered to. He controlled his environment completely. The outside world was chaotic and demanding. Inside Graceland, or inside his Vegas suite, the world revolved around him. He didn't have to deal with the complexities of real life. Priscilla Presley, in Elvis and Me, describes how he created this nocturnal world and expected everyone else to live in it. He surrounded himself with people who would play along. He could have, with his resources, found ways to live a more normal life. Other major celebrities have managed to do so, but he seemed to lack the will or the desire. Perhaps the isolation suited his growing paranoia. Perhaps he liked being the master of his own small universe. The argument here is that he wasn't just a victim of his fame, he was a co-conspirator in his own imprisonment. He traded freedom for control. He chose the cage because inside it he was safe and he was in charge. So was he the tragic bird who couldn't fly, or the man who built his own cage and locked the door from the inside? Was his isolation forced upon him, or was it a deliberate choice made by a man who couldn't cope with the real world? If he had made a determined effort, could he have carved out a more normal existence for himself? Did he secretly enjoy the drama and isolation of his life, finding it preferable to the mundane reality of everyday life? Was the prison of fame a convenient excuse for his unwillingness to face his own demons? At what point does a victim become a volunteer? And number 9, were the Vegas years a triumph or a tragedy? When Elvis Presley returned to live performing in July 1969 at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, it was a monumental triumph. After years of making bad movies, he was back where he belonged, on a stage in front of a live audience. The comeback special of 1968 had reminded the world that he was a powerful, charismatic performer. But Vegas was the confirmation he was in great shape. His voice was incredible, perhaps better than ever. He had a fantastic band, the TCB band, and the best backup singers. You know, those early Vegas shows are the stuff of legend. He was energetic, funny, and connected with the audience. He sang his classic hits, but he also sang contemporary songs. He was relevant again. For a few years, from 1969 to about 1972, Elvis in Vegas was the hottest ticket in the world. It was an artistic and commercial peak. This view celebrates the Vegas years as a brilliant third act in his career. He reinvented himself as the ultimate showman. He created the iconic jumpsuit look. He defined the modern Las Vegas residency. He was performing for sold-out crowds, making more money than ever before. He seemed happy. He was back in control of his music, free from the constraints of Hollywood. This was Elvis the King in his element, holding court in the showroom capital of the world. But there's a much darker and ultimately more prevalent view of the Vegas years. This narrative sees Vegas not as a triumph, but as the beginning of the end. It was a slow-motion tragedy played out under the spotlights. The initial triumph soon gave way to a grueling, repetitive routine. 2 shows a night for weeks on end. It was a grind. The excitement faded. The shows became formulaic. Elvis became bored. His performances became erratic. Sometimes he would be brilliant. Other times he would be bloated, slurring his words, forgetting lyrics, or going on long, rambling monologues. This is the Elvis documented in Elvis What Happened and in the later chapters of Guronic's Careless Love. He was trapped in a new kind of prison. The Las Vegas residency was a golden treadmill he couldn't get off. Colonel Parker had locked him into long-term contracts. To cope with the punishing schedule and the chronic boredom, his prescription drug use escalated dramatically. He needed pills to get up for a show, uppers, and pills to go to sleep after a show downers. The iconic jumpsuits, which at first showcased a trim, powerful performer, became necessary to hide his expanding waistline. The tragedy of Vegas is watching a great artist slowly decline, becoming a parody of himself, night after night, in front of an audience that just wanted to see the legend. So which was it? The glorious reign of the King of Vegas, or the sad, sequined spectacle of a man dying on stage? Like so many Elvis contradictions, it was both. It started as a triumph and ended as a tragedy. Could Elvis have maintained the artistic integrity of his live shows if he had performed less frequently? Was the Las Vegas environment, with its 24/7 excess, the worst possible place for a man with an addictive personality? If he had toured the world instead of staying in Vegas, would the variety have kept him more engaged and healthier? Or was the decline inevitable, regardless of the venue? Number 8, was his relationship with Priscilla a love story or grooming? The love story between Elvis and Priscilla is a central part of his myth. They met in Germany in 1959. He was a 24-year-old soldier, the biggest star in the world. She was Priscilla Beaulieu, the 14-year-old stepdaughter of an Air Force captain. He was instantly smitten. He courted her. He won over her parents. He promised to take care of her. When he returned to the States, he brought her to live at Graceland. They eventually married in 1967, and their daughter, Lisa Marie, was born exactly 9 months later. For years, they were seen as a fairy tale couple, the king and his beautiful young queen. Priscilla's own book, Elvis and Me, published in 1985, largely frames the relationship as a romance. She describes a man who was gentle, loving, and protective. She says he was a father figure to her as well as a lover. He wanted to mold her into his ideal woman. He picked out her clothes, her hairstyle, her makeup. She writes that she was happy to do it because she loved him. He was a traditional man who wanted a virgin bride. According to her account, they did not consummate their relationship until their wedding night. This narrative presents a somewhat unconventional but ultimately consensual and loving relationship. But viewed through a modern lens, the story is deeply troubling. The age difference is the most glaring issue. He was an adult man, she was a child, a high school freshman. The power imbalance was immense. He was a world-famous celebrity with enormous wealth and influence. She was a teenager, isolated from her family, living in his home, entirely dependent on him. The idea of him molding her, which is presented as romantic in one context, can easily be seen as coercive and controlling in another. He dictated how she looked, what she wore, and how she acted. Critics and biographers like Albert Goldman have painted a much darker picture. They question the platonic nature of their relationship before marriage. They see Elvis's interest in very young girls as a disturbing pattern. They argue that he was not protecting Priscilla, he was grooming her, he was creating a fantasy woman who would have no identity of her own, who would exist only to please him. This perspective sees the relationship not as a fairy tale, but as a deeply problematic and potentially predatory arrangement. Priscilla herself has, in more recent years, acknowledged the difficulties and the loss of her own identity during that time. She left him in 1972, a move many see as her finally breaking free and finding herself. So was it a genuine, if unusual, love story between two people who met at different stages of life? Or was it a case of a powerful man taking advantage of a vulnerable young girl? The same set of facts can be used to support either conclusion, and how you see it depends heavily on the lens through which you view love, power, and consent. Did Elvis's own arrested development, his own emotional immaturity, make him feel more comfortable with a teenager than with a woman his own age? Was Priscilla a willing participant in creating her own image, or was she a victim with no real choice? If the same situation occurred today with a modern celebrity, how would the public and the legal system react? And can we ever truly separate the story from the social norms of the era in which it took place? Number 7. The 68 comeback, a triumphant return or a last stand. On December 3rd, 1968, a television special called Singer Presents Elvis aired on NBC. It is now universally known as the 68 Comeback Special. For most of the 1960s, Elvis had been absent from the music scene, churning out mediocre movies and their soundtracks. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the counterculture had taken over. To many, Elvis was a joke, a relic of the 50s. The special was supposed to be a standard, safe, Christmas-themed show. Colonel Parker wanted him in a tuxedo singing carols. But Elvis, along with the show's producer, Steve Binder, had other ideas. Elvis was hungry. He wanted to prove he was still relevant. He was nervous, but he was also fired up. Binder pushed him to ditch the safe format and do something real. The result was electrifying. Dressed head to toe in black leather, Elvis looked incredible. He was lean, dangerous, and charismatic. He performed with a raw power and energy he hadn't shown in years. The highlight was an informal, in the round jam session with his original band members, Scotty Moore and DJ Fontana. It was raw, sweaty, and real. He was funny, he was self-deprecating, and he could still sing. The special was a massive critical and commercial success. It relaunched his career. It led directly to his return to Memphis to record his acclaimed album From Elvis in Memphis and his triumphant return to the stage in Las Vegas. The comeback special is seen as one of the greatest moments in music television history. It was a true resurrection, that is the standard, and very compelling narrative. But there is another way to look at it. Was it a new beginning, or was it the last brilliant flash of the old fire? This perspective argues that the 68 comeback wasn't a sustainable return to form. It was a final, desperate burst of greatness from an artist who would soon succumb to his worst instincts. It was a temporary victory. He proved he could still be the Elvis of the 50s, the raw, rebellious rock and roller. But he couldn't maintain it. Soon after, he retreated back into the safety of the Las Vegas machine. The black leather was replaced by the gaudy jumpsuits. The small, intimate band was replaced by a massive orchestra. The raw energy was replaced by a polished, professional show. While he had moments of brilliance in the 70s, he never again captured the sustained fire and hunger of that 1968 performance. The special, in this light, looks less like a comeback and more like a glorious last stand. It was a brief moment when he fought back against the Colonel, against his own apathy, and against the image he had become. But the fight was too hard. The comfortable prison of Vegas was waiting. So, was it the start of a brilliant new chapter? Or was it the beautiful, tragic end of the book, even if a few more pages were yet to be written? Was it a rebirth or a magnificent final breath? What would have happened if Elvis had built on the raw, stripped-down sound of the comeback special instead of moving to the big Vegas productions? Was Steve Binder the only person who could have pushed him to that level of performance, and was his absence a key reason for the later decline? Did the success of the special paradoxically seal his fate by making him a lucrative enough commodity to be locked into the Vegas contracts? And did Elvis himself know, on some level, that this was his last truly great moment? Number 6, was he addicted to drugs or a victim of a medical problem? Elvis Presley's death on August 16, 1977, was officially attributed to cardiac arrest. He was 42 years old, but everyone knew the real story was more complicated. His body was bloated, his health had been terrible for years, and his abuse of prescription drugs was an open secret. The official story at the time was that the drugs were not the primary cause of death, but may have been a contributing factor. His personal physician, Dr. George Nikopoulos, Dr. Nick, was later charged with overprescribing medications, though he was acquitted. For years, the dominant narrative has been that Elvis was a drug addict who slowly killed himself with pills. This narrative is supported by overwhelming evidence. The book, Elvis, What Happened? He would take pills to sleep, pills to wake up, pills to perform, and pills to relax. His girlfriend Linda Thompson and other members of his entourage have described his dependence in detail. He would send his private jet on trips to pick up prescriptions. He suffered from mood swings, paranoia, and memory loss, all classic signs of long-term prescription drug abuse. He had multiple near-death overdoses. From this perspective, it's a straightforward, if tragic, story of addiction. He was an addict, plain and simple, and his death was a direct result of his addiction. However, in recent years, a counter-narrative has emerged. This theory, championed by some fans and even some medical professionals who have reviewed his records, suggests that Elvis was not just a typical addict seeking a high. He was a man in chronic pain, suffering from a host of serious and possibly genetic medical conditions. He had high blood pressure, an enlarged colon, glaucoma, and liver damage. Some researchers have suggested he may have suffered from autoimmune diseases. The argument is that he was taking a massive amount of medication not to get high, but to treat these legitimate and painful conditions. He was self-medicating for his physical ailments. This view also points to the fact that Elvis did not drink alcohol. He didn't smoke. He didn't use illegal street drugs. His drug of choice was prescription medication provided by a doctor. In his own mind, he may not have seen himself as an addict. He saw himself as a patient following a doctor's orders. Dr. Nick himself has argued that he was trying to manage Elvis's complex health issues and that weaning him off the drugs was nearly impossible given the demands of his performance schedule. So, was he a reckless addict, chasing a high and ignoring all the warnings? Or was he a man in constant physical agony, desperately and misguidedly trying to manage his pain so he could continue to work? Was the addiction a cause of his health problems, or was it a symptom of pre-existing conditions? If he had been an ordinary person and not a superstar, would his doctors have diagnosed and treated him differently? How much responsibility lies with the medical professionals who continued to prescribe him dangerous quantities of drugs? And does the distinction between addict and patient even matter if the end result is the same? That's number 5. The Army years did they save him or ruin him? In 1958, at the absolute peak of his fame, Elvis Presley was drafted into the U.S. Army. It was a massive international news story. He was the biggest star in the world, and he was trading it all in for a standard GI haircut and a 2-year tour of duty. For many, this was a brilliant public relations move, masterminded by Colonel Parker. But Elvis could have taken the easy route. He was offered a spot in the Special Services where he could have spent his time entertaining the troops and living in comfort. But the colonel insisted he serve as a regular soldier. He wanted Elvis to be seen as a humble, patriotic American boy, doing his duty just like everyone else. The move worked perfectly. It neutralized the critics who saw him as a rebellious, dangerous influence on teenagers. It made him acceptable to older, more conservative Americans. When he came out of the Army in 1960, his fan base was broader than ever. The Army years, in this view, were a career-saving move that ensured his long-term viability as an all-American icon. But there is a compelling argument that the Army years were a disaster for him, both personally and artistically. First, there was the music. The Army took him out of circulation at the exact moment he was at his most creative and revolutionary. The raw, dangerous energy of his son and early RCA recordings was gone. When he came back, the music was different. It was smoother, more polished, and more mainstream pop. He had lost his edge. The 2 years away created a creative void that he never fully recovered. More importantly, it was in the Army in Germany that Elvis was first introduced to amphetamines. Soldiers used them to stay awake on duty. This was the beginning of his lifelong dependence on prescription drugs. It was also in Germany that he met the 14-year-old Priscilla Beaulieu, a relationship that would define much of his personal life. And perhaps most devastatingly, it was while he was in Germany that his beloved mother, Gladys, died back in Memphis. He was granted emergency leave to attend her funeral, but he was shattered. He never fully recovered from her death. The Army took him away from his mother during her final months. From this perspective, the Army didn't save him. It broke him. It derailed his artistic momentum, introduced him to drugs, and took him away during a critical family tragedy. So, was it a masterstroke of public relations that secured his legendary status? Or was it a personal and artistic catastrophe that planted the seeds of his eventual destruction? If Elvis had not been drafted, would his music have evolved in a different, more authentic direction? Was the loss of his mother, combined with his introduction to pills, a fatal combination from which he could never escape? Did the discipline of the army actually help him, or did it just teach him how to function while on drugs? And could Colonel Parker have foreseen the devastating personal consequences of his brilliant career move? Number 4. Did he steal the show from his own opening acts? This is a lesser-known but fascinating contradiction that speaks to his character as a performer. The common story is that Elvis was generous to other artists. He would often praise his influences. He hired the best musicians and singers for his own show and paid them well. He seemed to respect talent. On stage, he was the undisputed star, but he would give his backup singers like Kathy Westmoreland or the Sweet Inspirations their own moments in the spotlight. He seemed confident enough in his own talent that he didn't need to diminish others. However, there are several famous stories that suggest a different, more insecure side. In the early days, when he was just starting out, he was sometimes an opening act himself. But he quickly became a phenomenon who was impossible to follow. In 1956, he was booked to open for the Bill Haley and His Comet show in Jacksonville, Florida. And Elvis caused such a riot that the headliners could barely get on stage. He was simply too explosive. But the more telling stories come from his Vegas years when he was the headliner. He hired Jackie Wilson, a dynamic R&B singer and performer whom Elvis deeply admired, to open for him. Wilson was a phenomenal talent, an incredible dancer and vocalist. The story goes that Wilson's performance was so energetic and so well received by the crowd that Elvis became jealous. He felt upstaged. After a few nights, Wilson was let go. A similar story is told about comedian Jackie Kahane, who was a frequent opener for Elvis. This Elvis was known for playing pranks on his opening acts, sometimes disrupting their sets from backstage. While some saw this as good-natured fun, others saw it as a sign of insecurity, a need to ensure that no one else got too much applause. He needed to be the only star. So which was he? The confident king who was happy to share the stage with other talented performers? Or the insecure star who couldn't stand the thought of being upstaged, even by his own hand-picked opening act? It's a contradiction that pits his well-known generosity against a deep-seated professional insecurity. Was Elvis's alleged jealousy of other performers a sign of a fragile ego, or the natural competitiveness of a top-tier artist? Were the pranks on his openers just harmless fun, or a deliberate attempt to undermine their performances? And how many other talented artists were dismissed or not hired because Elvis or the Colonel feared they would shine too brightly? Number 3, was his mother's love a blessing or a curse? The relationship between Elvis and his mother, Gladys, is the emotional core of his entire life story. He was her only surviving child. His twin brother, Jesse Garon, was stillborn. Gladys adored him. She was fiercely protective of him. They had an incredibly close, almost telepathic bond. They had their own baby talk. They shared everything. When he was a boy, she would walk him to school every day. When he became famous, the first thing he did was buy her a big house, Graceland. Her death in 1958, at the age of 46, was the single greatest trauma of his life. He was inconsolable. Many biographers, including Elaine Dundee in her book Elvis and Gladys, argue that he spent the rest of his life trying to fill the void she left. His love for his mother is seen as his most pure and defining characteristic. This narrative presents their bond as a beautiful, powerful love story. Her love gave him the confidence to become the man he was. Her belief in him was absolute. She was his anchor, his safe harbor. When that anchor was gone, he was lost at sea. His subsequent problems end up the drugs, the isolation, the search for spiritual meaning can all be traced back to this one devastating loss. But there is a darker psychological interpretation of their relationship. This view suggests that their bond, while loving, was also deeply unhealthy and codependent. Gladys was an anxious, overbearing mother. Her love was smothering. She instilled in him many of her own fears. Because of their intense closeness, Elvis never fully grew up. He remained emotionally a child, always seeking his mother's approval, always needing a maternal figure to take care of him. After she died, he tried to recreate that dynamic with other women, including Priscilla. He wanted to be cared for, to be mothered. This emotional immaturity, this inability to function as a self-reliant adult made him vulnerable. It made him susceptible to the control of Colonel Parker, another powerful father figure. It made him dependent on the Memphis Mafia to create a safe, womb-like environment around him. In this light, Gladys's love was not a blessing that empowered him, but a curse that crippled him emotionally, leaving him unable to cope with the adult world after she was gone. Was Gladys the source of his strength and confidence, or was she the source of the emotional dependency that ultimately led to his downfall? It is the classic psychological dilemma: can too much love be a bad thing? Did Elvis ever resent his mother's overwhelming presence in his life? If Gladys had lived, would she have been able to save him from his addictions, or would she have become another enabler? Was his lifelong search for a perfect, pure love an attempt to replicate his relationship with his mother, an impossible standard that doomed his relationships with other women? Number two, was he a conservative patriot or a quiet rebel? Elvis Presley's public image, especially in his later years, was that of a true blue American patriot. He served his country in the army. He loved law enforcement and collected police badges. He was famously photographed with President Richard Nixon at the White House in December 1970. During that meeting, Elvis expressed his concerns about the drug culture and the anti-American sentiment of the counterculture. He volunteered to be a federal agent at large to help fight the war on drugs. He recorded patriotic songs like An American Trilogy. In a time of social upheaval, he seemed to stand for traditional values: God, country, and family. This is the Elvis that many conservatives embraced. This image was carefully managed by Colonel Parker. It was good for business. It kept Elvis on the right side of the establishment and endeared him to a huge segment of the American population. Elvis himself seemed to genuinely hold these beliefs. He was raised in the conservative South. He respected authority. His famous letter to Nixon, which he handwrote on a flight to Washington, seems genuinely sincere in its patriotic anti-drug fervor. But this image is completely at odds with the Elvis who started it all. The Elvis of the 1950s was the very definition of a rebel. His music, his sneer, his swiveling hips, it was all a direct challenge to the conservative, button-down culture of the Eisenhower era. He was seen as a threat to decency. Preachers condemned him from the pulpit. Parents forbade their children from listening to his music. He was the original rock and roll rebel, the symbol of youth defiance. He mixed black and white music, breaking down cultural barriers. He was in his own way a revolutionary figure. So what happened? Did he change? Or was he always a conservative at heart and his early rebellion was just an accidental byproduct of his musical style? Some argue that he never stopped being a rebel. His rebellion just became more private. He rebelled against the constraints of his own fame. He rebelled against his own body with his drug use. His bizarre meeting with Nixon can even be seen as a surreal, rebellious act of drug-addled superstar conning his way into the Oval Office to get a federal badge. He was a man who performed a song called An American Trilogy, which combined a Confederate anthem, Dixie, with a Union anthem, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and a black spiritual, All My Trials. You know, that's not a simple political statement, it's a deeply complex and contradictory one. Was he the clean-cut patriot who met with Nixon, or was he the leather-clad rebel who scared a generation of parents? The contradiction lies in whether his true nature was one of conformity or defiance. Was the Nixon meeting a sincere act of patriotism, or the bizarre stunt of a man obsessed with collecting police badges? Did Elvis truly believe in the war on drugs while being one of its most prominent casualties? And was his early rebellion a conscious choice, or was he just a young man singing the music he loved, unaware of the cultural shockwaves he was creating? Number one, did he die by accident or by a slow suicide? This is the ultimate contradiction. It's the question that hangs over everything. How did Elvis Presley die? The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, a heart attack. The autopsy report and the toxicology reports that were later unsealed showed his body was filled with a cocktail of prescription drugs: codeine, Valium, morphine, and others. But they were found to be prescribed therapeutic level doses, not overdose levels. This led to the official ruling of a natural death, albeit one complicated by drug use. It is the accidental death theory. His heart, weakened by a poor diet, high blood pressure, and other health problems, simply gave out. The drugs were a contributing factor, but not the direct cause. His family and his estate have long maintained this version of events. But for many, this explanation is impossible to believe. The sheer volume and variety of drugs in his system, combined with his long history of abuse and near overdoses, point to another conclusion. This is the suicide by lifestyle theory. This theory argues that while he may not have taken a single massive overdose on that final day, his death was the inevitable result of years of systematic self-destruction. He knew the drugs were killing him, his doctors warned him, his friends warned him. He had seen the damage they were doing to his body and his mind, but he refused to stop. In this view, his death was not an accident. It was the result of a long series of choices. He chose to continue taking the pills. He chose to eat a dangerously unhealthy diet. He chose to live a sedentary, isolated life. Was this a conscious death wish? Perhaps not. But it was, at the very least, a reckless disregard for his own life. Some, like his stepbrother, David Stanley, have even gone so far as to suggest he did it intentionally, that he was tired of the pain, the loneliness, and the prison of being Elvis Presley. He was tired of living, so he just let go. Albert Goldman's biography strongly supports the idea that Elvis was on a suicidal path. He describes a man in deep despair, knowingly and methodically destroying himself. So, was it a tragic medical accident that could have happened to anyone with his health problems? Or was it the final act of a man who had decided, consciously or unconsciously, that he no longer wanted to live? The official record says one thing. The reality of his life suggests another. The contradiction is between what is written on a death certificate and what can be read between the lines of a life. What was Elvis's state of mind in his final days and hours? Did the betrayal he felt from the Elvis what happened? And the most haunting question of all, was there a part of Elvis that was relieved when it was all over?